Okay, so today we are launching into a topic that's incredibly important for understanding the 20th century, French Indochina.
Right.
And we're not just looking at a timeline. We want to get into the machinery of it.
Yeah.
How did France actually run this place from halfway around the world?
It's a great question because you have to start with the sheer scale of it. French Indochina, we're talking about the land that is now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos.
A huge area.
Oh, massive.
Yeah.
About 285,000 square miles.
To put that in perspective for you, that's roughly the size of Texas.
Yeah.
It's a gigantic piece of land for a European country to control from Paris.
Exactly. And the geography was everything. You've got the South China Sea on one side, which is, a critical shipping lane. Then you've got land borders with Thailand and, of course, China.
And inside those borders?
It's incredibly diverse, thick jungles, rugged mountains. But the most important feature really was the river deltas.
The Mekong River, I assume.
Yeah.
That had to be the prize.
Absolutely. The Mekong is the lifeblood. It's what supported the farming, the population, everything. Most people lived right along the coast or near that river because the soil was just perfect for growing rice.
So if you control the Mekong, you control the economy.
You control the heart of the region, no question.
So how did the French get there? I mean, their presence didn't just start with gunboats and soldiers.
Not at all. It was a much slower burn. It actually began way back in the 17th century.
That early.
Yeah, with French Catholic missionaries and some traders. They were just trying to get a foothold, spread their religion, look for business. But by the mid-1800s, the whole game changed.
The age of empire.
The age of empire.
Yeah.
And the dynamic shifted from trade to outright military conquest.
Was there a specific trigger? I mean, you don't just decide to invade one day.
Well, the French saw the area as a kind of backdoor into the huge China market. And things like the persecution of missionaries gave them a justification, a casus belli, an excuse to intervene militarily.
And the real military push started when?
The key moment was the capture of Saigon in 1859.
Saigon. Right in the south, in that fertile delta.
Exactly. That was the real beginning. From there, they just slowly expanded, taking more and more territory.
Until they made it official.
Right. In 1887, they formally created the Union of Indochina. That was it. The whole colonial system legally locked in place.
And by forming this union, they were lumping together all these different groups and kingdoms, Cambodia, Laos, the different regions of Vietnam, under one single French administration.
And their public reason for this was what they called the civilizing mission.
Bringing European technology and culture.
That was the line, yes. But the structure they actually built was all about control. At the very top, you had the governor general.
One person appointed by Paris.
One incredibly powerful official, yeah. He lived in Hanoi or Saigon and basically ran the whole show.
And below him, the territory was chopped up into different pieces. We've all heard the names Tonkin, Annam, Cochin China.
Right, which roughly make up modern Vietnam.
Okay.
And then you had Cambodia and Laos as separate parts. But what's really key is that these divisions were strategic.
How so?
It was a way to divide people who shared a culture, to create rivalries. It made it much harder for any kind of unified opposition to form.
A classic divide and conquer strategy. And they didn't even govern all these regions the same way.
No, not at all. Cochin China in the south was run as a direct colony.
So basically a province of France.
So pretty much. French officials, French law, the whole thing. But the other parts, Tonkin, Annam, Cambodia, Laos, those were labeled protectorates.
Protectorates. So they still had their own kings, right? That sounds a little softer.
It sounds softer, but it was really a facade. They kept the local king or emperor on the throne. Sure, it looked good.
But he had no real power.
Zero. The king couldn't decide anything about money or laws or foreign policy. The real power was with the French officials in every single important government office. Tax collection, police, you name it, a Frenchman was in charge.
And to run all that, you would need a huge number of people. A whole civil service.
A massive civil service.
Yeah.
And all the top jobs, running the courts, the police, the tax system, those were reserved for French citizens who moved over from Europe.
But they couldn't do it all themselves?
Of course not. They needed locals for the lower level jobs. But to get one of those jobs, you had to speak French. You had to adopt European customs.
So that created a whole new social class.
It did, an educated French-speaking group, but they were always treated as second class. They never got the same pay or the same authority as their French bosses.
And that must have defined the whole atmosphere. I've read the bureaucracy was just incredibly slow.
Infamously slow.
Yeah.
So much paperwork. It was an environment that was just ripe for frustration and, corruption.
And the social division wasn't just at the office.
No, it was physical. The French lived in their own separate neighborhoods in these new exclusive parts of the cities. They had their own schools, their own private clubs.
So it wasn't just a side effect, it was intentional.
It was policy to keep a deep, uncrossable line between the rulers and the people they ruled.
Wow, okay, so you have this social structure in place, but what was the engine driving the whole thing? Why were they there?
One word: money. The whole point of the colony was to extract wealth and natural resources.
And the main products were what?
If you look at the exports, it was really three things: rice, rubber, and coal. Let's talk about rubber for a second.
Okay.
The French set up these enormous plantations, mostly in Cambodia and southern Vietnam. We're not talking small farms.
These were industrial-scale operations.
Totally. All designed to feed one specific market: the brand new international tire industry. The world needed rubber for cars, and Indochina was France's private supply.
And for rice, they actually changed the landscape, didn't they?
They did. They built huge irrigation systems all across the Mekong Delta. The goal was just to produce as much rice as possible for export.
And this is the critical part. The profits from all that rice and rubber, they didn't stay in Vietnam.
Not at all. They went straight to French companies, French shareholders in Paris. The people growing the crops saw almost none of it.
And then you have the tax system, which seems designed to make things even harder for the local farmers.
It was. They required taxes to be paid in cash.
Not in rice, but cash.
Cash. And that was a deliberate strategy. A farmer who only grew food for his family suddenly had to sell his crop on the market to get cash for the taxman.
So the food he grew to eat
Had to be sold instead.
Yeah.
It guaranteed a constant, cheap supply of rice for French exporters to buy up and sell overseas. The whole economy was designed from top to bottom to benefit France.
And to move all these resources, you need infrastructure.
Exactly. They invested a lot in it. They needed to move goods to the ports and move troops around quickly.
So we're talking about railways.
Thousands of miles of them. The famous one connected Hanoi in the north all the way to Saigon in the south. They also built paved roads into really remote areas.
Which is incredible when you think that these things were built by hand in brutal conditions.
The human cost was staggering, absolutely. They also strung telegraph lines across the jungle for instant communication between cities, and they built huge deep water ports like in Haiphong for the big steamships.
So they controlled the land, the economy. Next, they had to control the ideas. And that's where education comes in.
Right. They set up a new school system, but it had a very, very specific goal.
It wasn't about educating everyone.
Not even close. It was about training a small, select group of locals to be clerks and interpreters, just enough to help run the administration, and all the teaching was in French.
Which had huge cultural effects. Traditional writing systems started to decline.
It created this massive gap in society. You had this small French-speaking elite in the cities, and then everyone else, the vast majority of farmers in the countryside, was often left illiterate.
So speaking French became a symbol of status.
The ultimate symbol of status and power.
And that carried over into the justice system, which was complicated.
It was a dual system, basically two sets of laws. If you were French, you were subject to French law in French courts.
And if you were Vietnamese or Cambodian.
You followed a mix of old traditional laws and new colonial rules. But in any serious case, a French judge always had the final say.
So the system was pretty clearly biased.
Oh, completely. It was all about protecting colonial interests. They used the courts to enforce those tax laws we talked about. People were arrested all the time for not paying, and they kept expanding the police to crush any kind of dissent.
What about public health? I know the French did build hospitals.
They did, but you have to look at the motivation. Colonial officials were terrified of tropical diseases like malaria and smallpox.
Not just for humanitarian reasons.
Not primarily. It was because sick workers and dead administrators were bad for business. You needed a healthy workforce.
So they set up the Pasteur Institutes for research, built modern hospitals in big cities like Hanoi.
Yeah, and they ran vaccination programs, built clean water systems in the cities. These things absolutely saved lives. There's no denying that.
But I'm guessing the access wasn't exactly equal?
Not at all. All these medical advances were concentrated in the cities where the French lived. If you were in a remote village, you were still relying on traditional medicine.
When you put it all together, the French architecture, the language, the food, it must have created this very unique culture in the cities.
It did. You had these grand opera houses and cathedrals right next to traditional markets. They introduced bread, coffee, pastries, things that are still a huge part of the culture today.
But even with that blending, This segregation was still there.
Absolutely. The social life for the French revolved around their own private clubs and cafes. European culture was always held up as the standard, and the two groups stayed very much separate.
And with that kind of division and the economic pressure, resistance was inevitable.
It was guaranteed, and it started almost right away.
At first from the old royal court, right?
Yeah.
The nobles who lost all their power.
Exactly. But the really important shift came later. The resistance changed from these elite uprisings to organized nationalist movements
Led by who?
by educated students, teachers, city workers, people who used modern tools, newspapers, secret meetings to organize for independence.
And what was the French response?
Brutal suppression. They used the police and military to crush any protest. Activists were sent to prison islands or forced into exile.
But it didn't work.
It didn't. They would cut off the head of one group, and another would just grow in its place. Over time, these small rebel groups grew into major political and military movements that challenged the whole system.
And that pressure just built and built, especially after World War II, when French authority was seriously weakened.
The war really shattered the myth of French invincibility, and by the time it was over, the desire for self-rule was just too strong to contain.
It led to decades of conflict.
Long, terrible conflicts that eventually forced the French out and led to the creation of the independent nations of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos that we know today.
So the story of French Indochina is really about how a colonial power builds this incredibly efficient machine for control and extraction. But the very design of that machine creates the resistance that eventually tears it all down.
Exactly. And understanding all those layers, the economy, the social divisions, the infrastructure, it helps explain so much about the foundations of modern Southeast Asia, including the legacy you can still see in the architecture and language today.
Good luck with your studies.